This is Madia-as Digdigan Buenaflor, extending an invitation to each and every one of you everywhere, as my way of commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I will read and serialize my novel, The Blood of Three, starting on Tuesday, August 27, and continuing episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Follow the drama on my YouTube channel. May we forever exhale and inhale love and peace. Doesn't that look a bit suspicious? Ernesto commented. He kept himself abreast of world events. Greed, selfish agenda, power, disguised motivations. Could those be the other suspects? In the end, it's the civilians, especially children, who suffer. And for what? Material gains? Lota was upset. Joybel looked enraged. Do you know that children are now doing their father's work because their fathers have to escape to the hills? Her voice mellowed almost to a whisper when she thought of her friends. Children no longer have the time to act like children. They seem to have forgotten to play, to laugh, to dream. This tagged at Mr. Miura's heart. We're killing the dreams of our children, and we're doing it in the most horrendous way. Their experiences will forever be imprinted in their memories and in their nightmares. I have seen what they underwent, Ernesto volunteered. His eyes flickered between sadness and frustration. Yes, I have witnessed this madness of it all. It is a sight one couldn't easily forget, a travesty. It must have been a torture for you, Joybel wished she had shared the sight and lightened the burden in Ernesto's heart. I have seen firsthand how the city folks had suffered the most. Unlike civilians in towns and rural areas, they don't have the same resources available to them. Most of the cities are in ruins. Civilians live in makeshift homes of crates and burned scrap metal sheets. There are no places left to plant vegetables, nor water to fish. The people instead scramble for food, ravaging through garbage and anywhere else they can find anything edible. This burden have fallen on the children, who are more able to move around undetected. The children are suffering from scabies and malnutrition. They are the innocent victims. The Miuras listened to Ernesto with sadness. I don't understand why we have to resort to war. Could we not at least try to get along? Joybel was confused. It saddened her to think of the fear inflicted in young children when in the middle of the night they scurried into arid shelters, swamps or thickets at every rumor of impending enemy raids. When a girl her age, in her panic, stumbled on a pointed tree stump that gored through her thigh and almost bled to death. By the way, who decides to wage war? She was aching to find out, for if only she knew, she surely would love to talk to them. Oh yes, she would make them understand and say that war was not a game to be toyed with. Head of nations have the wisdom and the capacity to settle issues without resorting to war. If only they could, with humility, put themselves in each other's shoes and really try to understand what each one is trying to say, without minimizing or putting this down, and perhaps put aside their machismo and ego to admit that others besides themselves have legitimate reasons to be addressed. Mr. Miura heaved a deep sigh. Man hasn't learned from the past. Not yet. They all agreed at the moment. That was all they could do. Agree and pray in silence. It was almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Ernesto asked permission to leave. Do you stay far from here? Lota was concerned. She had treated Ernesto like her own son. She feared he might be mistaken for a guerrilla. Yes, quite far. How did you know we were here? Joybel was curious. Ernesto seemed uneasy. When I heard about the three of you, I knew it was your family, so I came. We're glad you did. You will visit us again, won't you? Joybel couldn't suppress her enthusiasm at seeing Ernesto again. This pleased him. Of course, of course. I'll be seeing you again, all of you. Joybel will accompany you to the outskirts of town, Mr. Miura added, after Lota handed Ernesto some food to take with him. You take care, Ernesto. Times are not the same anymore, Lota reminded him. It's best that you stay away from the Japanese soldiers, cautioned Mr. Miura. But just in case they mistake you for a guerrilla, tell them you are our friend and ask them to call me. Joybel and Ernesto listened tell them about their encounter earlier with a Japanese soldier. They didn't want them to worry. Ernesto thanked them and hugged them goodbye. He thanked Joybel especially for the many things he could not say at the moment. I'll see you all again, Ernesto waved at Mr. and Mrs. Miura as he followed Joybel down the stairs. May God be with you, whispered both Mr. and Mrs. Miura as they followed him with their sight. Joybel and Ernesto took the path behind the Miura's house and retraced their early route. As Ernesto and Joybel walked, they could hardly take their eyes from each other, knowing that it would be long before they could be together again. And as they reached the outskirts of town, near the creek, Ernesto clasped Joybel's hand tightly as if not wanting to leave her, and she looked at him with an unspoken invitation to stay longer. I'll be back. On the hill, he whispered. He kissed her on the cheek and walked away. Joybel called and ran after him. He stopped and turned around. She hugged him. I'm glad you came. It was dark. The sun had long gone down the distant horizon when Ernesto arrived. It was quiet all around except for the occasional sound of the birds and crickets and the rustling of the leaves in the thicket. Ernesto walked straight through the towering trees, passing a narrow zigzag trail that cut beneath the cliff by a stream, walking above and below fallen logs. The trail was damp and smelled of earth long deserted by the sun, of rotten leaves and dead worms, of stale muddy water. No sunlight penetrated this place, walled and roofed by the aged trees. Ernesto whistled softly as he passed through the gloomy, eerie pathway to divert his thoughts from the dreadful feeling of being suffocated in the endless tunnel. After walking for what felt like forever, he came out to a clearing in the heart of the forest. He had just wiped the sweat from his forehead when he heard the warning. Halt! Who goes there? The voice rang loud and echoed back, but he remained calm and composed. Captain Duran, he answered, then continued walking to the lighted hut. That night, after dinner, Joybel excused herself and went straight to her bedroom window, cupping her chin with her palms, wistfully looking up at the myriad stars that seemed to have suddenly burst through the clouds, their sparkling lights dancing gloriously for Joybel to relish and to nourish her dreams, many dreams, but above all, of Ernesto. Chapter 3. The night had enveloped the area. Night always came early in this place where the sun barely shone through. There seemed to be no daytime. In its place there was only twilight. The bamboo torch was a necessity, and it kept burning. Ernesto's stride got slower and heavier, but the memory of his visit buoyed up his spirit. He felt light and happy. He had just come down from the clouds. It was a trip he would very much like to repeat. Walking straight to a hut, he knocked on the door and a voice answered for him to enter. He pushed the door open, and the gush of wind from outside made the light from the table lamp flicker. He closed the door after him. "Captain Durant reporting, sir." He saluted as he stood in front of Colonel Holt's desk. The table and everything in the room, including the two bamboo chairs and the bench, were all makeshifts from bamboo and rough wood. The colonel, an American in his late 40s, acknowledged him with a salute and signaled him to a nearby bamboo chair beside his desk. Colonel Holt looked older than his age. Deep lines were readily seen on his forehead and under his eyes. The thick eyebrows that drooped at the sides have farther sagged down. Black rings appeared around his eyes, apparently from lack of sleep. For several nights he couldn't sleep. Besides his problems in his own group, he received news of the hostile rivalry between the two leaders of their two operating units in the adjacent provinces. He knew that such a situation could not be good for the now weakening morale of their men. It was incumbent on him to do something before the enemies could capitalize on such dissension and disunity among the guerrilla units in her sector of responsibility. He looked drained after he just wrote an appeal for harmony and cooperation to the two warring factions. Yet his deep blue eyes still projected his drive and self-confidence that gave his men courage and hope. He threw Ernesto a searching look, then clasped his fists together on his desk. "Were you able to enter the town, Captain?" "Yes, sir," Ernesto replied without hesitation. Again Colonel Holt paused, then continued. "Did you arouse any suspicion?" "At first," he quickly answered with a faint smile. "I found the girl, the one I told you about. Her family stays in town." "Good." Colonel Holt leaned back and relaxed for the first time that day, then looking at Ernesto again, this time more intently, as if trying to read his thoughts. "The girl was her childhood friend, I understand." "Yes, sir. She is now 16. Ernesto's voice belied his thought as the image of Joybel played in his mind. But his happy thought did not last long when he saw the colonel's serious face. Ernesto straightened up and waited for the colonel to continue. "A dispatch had reached me today about the rivalry between our two units in the adjacent provinces, which may prejudice our movement. But I received another message too, that the rest of the guerrilla units all over the country are coordinating for a most effective solidification of forces in preparation for the coming return of General MacArthur. It is our responsibility now to prepare for this by first of all securing reliable intelligence about the enemy forces." Ernesto listened intently. "Of course you are aware that our first concern is to know for sure the exact strength and capabilities of the enemy in that fortress in the town." "Yes, sir." "We need as much information as we can gather through your friends," the colonel continued without taking his eyes from Ernesto. Momentarily, Ernesto was silent, hoping that the colonel would move on to another subject. "Yes," he added in agreement. "The girl must be beautiful," Colonel Holt presumed. "But remember that your mission will enable the landing forces to gain a strong stronghold in Luzon. It is of gravest importance to us for the resistant movement," he paused. "You need a good rest." That concluded their talk for the evening. After the usual salute, Ernesto left. He realized the gravity of his mission. That night, Ernesto could not sleep. He got out of his hut, for even its nipa pan roof had not helped alleviate the heat. The night was hot. The rain would surely follow soon. He strolled around the clearing, passing by the guards, without seeming to see them. Casually, he went beneath the tree, sat down, and leaned against its trunk comfortably, arms crossed. He took a deep breath. It was Joybel, he remembered. So lovely and so sweet, he mused. A moth lighted on his arm. He picked this gently. So young and gentle and so innocent. he whispered, addressing the tiny insect. Then he let it fly away, his hand laid on the tall grass beside him. He pulled the blade and instinctively beat it with his lips, his thoughts flying, following the moth as it traced the light back to the torch. And once again he sighed. One of the guerrillas, Sammy, just 17, from the contingency of the Philippine Scout, who like him could not sleep that evening, strummed his guitar, letting a soft, nostalgic ballad, a condiment, softly fill the air. The tune was so reminiscent of a quiet evening in a peaceful village, of lovely maidens strolling the green fields, flagrant with the smell of ripe rice grains under one full moon, of 10 young men trailing behind them, armed with guitars, their melodious voices singing of their flight and their young love. The maidens would start whispering to one another, giggling modestly, as each young man would approach his lady. Ernesto smiled. He could be one of those men and Joy be one of the lovely maidens, if only there was a full moon, and the green fields, and a peaceful village. But it was war, and Joybell was so far away. Ernesto looked around at his companions, men of varied ages, some very young, the others wrinkled from the burden of their many years. They were out from their huts, maybe because of the heat, or maybe, like Ernesto, they could not help but remember the loved ones they have left behind. He could only guess that each one was thinking, but he was sure that each nursed a beautiful memory from years back with his wife, mother, children, sweetheart. It was painful to be so far away from one's beloved, but there was that certain feeling of pride, of self-worth, of commitment as each one thought of fighting for his country and for those dear to his heart. It was the thought of doing one's share in restoring peace and bringing back the interrupted tranquility of their life. It was this unconsuming patriotism which gave strength to these men who have come from all walks of life to gather in this forsaken thicket and call themselves guerrillas. This resistant movement was willing and ready to fight the invaders of the country they loved. They all dreamed of one common goal: to see their children free to roam the streets and walk to school, to see their wives happy doing their household chores, to see their family praying together in church, to see young men serenade their maidens, and to see old people enjoy the blessings of their ripening years. They all wished to see their loved ones free again from fear and abundant with peace and joy. That they were fighting for, these brave guerrillas. The strumming from the guitar had stopped, and the men slowly walked back to their huts, except for one. He must be reliving the nightmares that haunted him for years. Ernesto knew him well. Tommy was young and suffered much, but in spite of it all, he had a ready smile for everyone. His charm and love of life remained intact and endeared him to all. Ernesto remembered when he first joined them, Tommy was very ill. The camp had a hut for those who managed to escape from the death march, providing them with a place to hide and to recover. In Tommy's case, his battalion surrendered in Mariveles, Bataan, and barely survived the scorching death march that ended in Group 13, where 150 prisoners were dumped in one structure. Their group was in the 10,000 prisoners in Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Tarlac, where half perished from torture, starvation, and diseases. Their existence was subhuman: serve a bowl of thin broth once a day, filthy water, ravaged by malaria, beriberi, skin ulcers, tuberculosis. The prisoners dropped them like flies, the sick digging graves for the dead, until only 15 were left. The Japanese found no use for them, not even for torture. There was nothing left to torture but the staggering, gasping, gaping skeletons, the breathing dead, more appropriately, the gasping dead. That was what they were, and so they were released, no, discarded. Tears never failed to burn Tommy's eyes whenever he related his story, which was very rarely. One had to force it out from him. With Ernesto, however, because of their developed friendship, sharing it with him was quite therapeutic, as crying was to the cleansing of the soul. One just had to believe in it. He had enlisted with the USAFI and was proud of it. Despite the torture and assault to his mind, he had imprinted his identity into his soul and could recall instantly who he was, anytime, any place. He was Tommy Valenti, tag 115741, Sergeant D Company, Call, 31st Mid, BN, 31st Division. He slept and woke up with it. A week into training, Manila was bombed, same day as Pearl Harbor. Part of his duty with the medical battalion was to collect dog tags of their casualties, something that still haunted him. But his nightmare was of their medics' brains splashing into the patient he was attending to when he received a direct hit. Many of these men had their own stories, the horrors that stuck like glue and refused to be scratched off. Ernesto thought of sitting with Tommy, but he decided that leaving him alone to himself would do him more good. Tito is back, Tito is back, the lookout announced. This was followed by the jubilant cheering from the guerrillas, who came out from everywhere to greet Tito. His name echoed through the clearing as each man repeated it to the next. The throng gathered to receive Tito. Everyone had great expectation that morning when Tito and three others left to meet with the Teniente del Barrio, the Barrio Lieutenant nearby, sort of the village group leader. Abruptly, the cheering stopped. Ernesto made his way through the crowd. Oh no, Ernesto gasped as he saw the bloody body of Tito. Tito sank to the ground. His back showed a deep wound. Blood flowed every time he moved. Ernesto turned Tito around. His face was bathed with blood from a head wound. Fetch the doctor, he turned to one of the men. Ernesto cuddled the head of Tito on his lap. He looked around and found every man with head bowed, bitter and heartbroken. They were silent, but Ernesto knew how they felt. Every day their hope was ebbing away, their strength and spirit weakening. By now Colonel Holt appeared. The men stepped aside to give way to him. Ernesto and Colonel Holt just exchanged looks and read what the other was thinking. Tito, the colonel bent to talk to the man. What happened? Colonel Holt, Tito tried to speak, although blood oozed from the side of his mouth every time he spoke. My three companions are all dead, he continued with effort. I managed to escape, he gasped. Go on, Colonel Holt encouraged. We succeeded in getting the food from the Barrio Lieutenant, but before we could even finish loading into the cart, a truckload of Japanese soldiers arrived. The Barrio Lieutenant and his wife and their two children were shot and killed. Tito shivered. But worst of all was what they did to their 4-month-old baby. Oh God, it was horrible. Tito sobbed. His shoulder tossed the infant up into the air, right in front of her screaming mother, then caught him with a bayonet. Tito was now sobbing and covering his face, as if trying hard to erase the scene. Everyone was silent, but their fists were clenched and their jaws clamped. I'm sorry, Colonel. You did your best. We will have another chance. Somehow we'll manage, Colonel Holt assured him, but he knew that everything would not be all right from then on. No civilian would risk his life to help them. Their sympathizers were all brutally killed, hanged and exhibited to the public to serve as a lesson. From then on, they had to look for other ways and spare the civilians from the retaliation of the Japanese. Tito stopped. He lost so much blood, he was too weak to even move his hand. He closed his eyes. Then the doctor came. He had been fetched from another unit at a nearby hill. The guerrillas trailed behind Tito's body and converged outside the hut where he was taken. He was placed on a bamboo bench with a flickering torch beside it. The doctor tore his shirt open. On the makeshift table was a few surgical instruments. Ernesto and Colonel Holt joined the men outside the hut. For hours they waited as the doctor sweated it out, performing major surgery without the proper instruments to retrieve the bullet that had lodged in Tito's left chest. There was total silence as everyone squatted on the ground, waiting and praying for Tito's life. It was almost midnight, but no one had gone to sleep. No one could sleep. Then, the sound of the surgical instrument stopped. There was a cold, stony silence as they heard the door creak open. The doctor stood there, drenched in sweat, arms hanging down limply by his sides. Colonel Holt and Ernesto stood to meet him. The doctor shook his head. He's gone. We don't have the necessary instrument and medicine to save him. The doctor's words were said in almost a whisper, but everyone knew what he said. Tito is dead, Colonel Holt solemnly announced, but he died a hero. The four of them died heroes. Then he entered the hut. Slowly and quietly, each one stood to pray for the souls of the four guerrillas and the civilians who give up their lives trying to help their cause. Tommy had one more tag to collect. Ernesto stood solemnly before the body of Tito. A torch flickered just above his head. He laid on a bamboo bench and a torn gray blanket covered his limp body. Although there were no tears in Ernesto's eyes, his heart wept. Everybody's heart wept for Tito, and the other Ernesto's heart wept for his own parents, who met the same fate as the barrio lieutenant's family for helping the guerrillas. Tito was a young man, full of life and vitality. He was the live wire of the group. His presence meant laughter, and his enthusiasm was contagious. He joined the guerrillas just a month after he married his wife, a dark-eyed beauty from the village. Maybe she would never know. Maybe Celia was his wife's name, would be waiting for him, but she would be waiting forever. Colonel Holt was looking down too at the lifeless body of Tito, and as he stared at his bloody face, a kaleidoscope of scenes played before his eyes. There were the panicked civilians, the groans of soldiers, both Filipinos and Americans, as their bodies stiffened from the hot lids of the machine guns, the deafening sounds of the bombs as they dug into the earth around them, the smoke and the flames turning into an earthly inferno. And slowly the kaleidoscope of scenes settled down into one clear picture of thousands of captured Filipino and American soldiers, dragging their tattered shoes against the hot gravel and stones that cut their largely exposed feet, their emaciated bodies beaten both by the scorching sun and the heavy rains along the long road to the concentration camp of Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Japanese soldiers prodding them all the way with beatings. Colonel Holtshud had been one of those captured soldiers of the Death March, but he and a few of his men who survived their last encounter defied the order of General Wainwright to surrender. They decided to fight rather than surrender, and fight they did, only for a few days. Ultimately, they were captured and forced to follow the thousands of Filipinos and American soldiers in a march that promised no end. He banded together with his men, supporting each other when some of them lagged behind. But at one point, the sight of a river drove his men mad as they stumbled and staggered to the river to quench their thirst. He did not have the heart to stop them, but a barrage of gunshots for the Japanese did. He ran after them and used his body to shield them, but one body was not enough. Even in death, their hands were reaching for the water that was not even there. The river was dry, for the last drop of water was either swallowed by the cracked silts or by the scorching sun. Together with his men, he too was left behind for dead. After the last men from the long line of prisoners had passed him, he crawled as far away as his body could carry him. What he saw from where he hid reinforced his decision to escape and do something. He saw Filipinos and American soldiers unarmed and hungry, sick and wounded, beaten, kicked, bayoneted, and shot for being unable to keep up with the long, tortuous march. He resolved then and there that he would continue to fight. After days of hunger and hiding with untreated wounds, he joined a group of unyielding Filipinos who, like him, went into hiding somewhere in the mountains of Luzon. These men have now become part of him. They have suffered together the cruelty of the elements and the constant bitter struggle for survival. Everyone suffered by his men became his own. Their every loss his agony. He died a little as each of his men met his end. Colonel Holt stood immobile, staring down at the still, tense face of Tito. Even now the strain of the war was markedly visible, there even in death. Gently, Colonel Holt pulled up the blanket and covered Tito's face, hoping to blank out the suffering that war had inflicted on this young soul. Captain Duran, Colonel Holt addressed Ernesto. Assign a detail to dig Tito's grave. Colonel Holt's eyes were red and his face tense. Yes, sir, Ernesto answered. Then the colonel walked out in slow, heavy footsteps. His figure, all 6 feet and 5 inches, drooped heavily with the burden of his loss and responsibility. He was tired, very tired. May God bless his soul and the souls of Fermin, Molong, and Joaquin, and may they find eternal peace. Ernesto silently prayed and walked away. The torch flickered as a soft wind blew. The nights suddenly turned cold. That's all for today, to be continued on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Thanks for being with me. I hope you will inspire me with a like, share, and subscribe.